The wind swept hard across the endless Montana prairie, carrying with it the sting of dry dust and the sharp tang of sagebrush, whistling low as if the land itself wanted to warn anyone daring enough to tread into its open expanse that something unusual was waiting here, something old and alive and heavy with meaning, a secret born from both violence and compassion, from the eternal rhythm of predator and prey that had defined this land long before men set foot upon it, yet today it was destined to reveal itself in a way that challenged every rule of the wild, and that revelation began with a buffalo. He was massive even by the standards of his kind, close to 2,000 pounds of living strength, his chestnut-brown coat matted with dust and streaks of dried blood, his hump rising like a hill above his shoulders, his curved horns black and sharp as obsidian, catching the dim light that filtered through the gathering storm clouds. Yet what struck the wildlife biologist Elijah Crow most deeply was not the buffalo's size, not even the wounds that scored his flank and the way he shifted his weight from one heavy leg to the other as though struggling against exhaustion, but rather the expression in his dark, glistening eyes, an expression of focus, determination, and something that might even be called defiance, as though this animal, who should by instinct have fled from human approach, was instead standing as a sentinel, rooted to one spot in the middle of the dirt road, broad head lowered and nostrils flaring as he let out a bellow so low and resonant that it rattled in Elijah's chest like the echo of thunder rolling down from distant mountains. Elijah had spent decades on these lands, first as a park ranger and later as a researcher specializing in the behavior of bison herds, and he had seen enough to know that something was wrong. Buffalo avoided roads unless driven across them, they did not hold ground in plain view unless threatened or trapped, and above all they did not lock eyes with humans unless they meant to challenge them, yet this bull seemed neither aggressive nor afraid. His stance suggested protection, as though he were not guarding himself but something else, something hidden. Elijah slowed his truck, the tires crunching over gravel as he leaned forward, squinting through the dust rising in swirls around the giant frame ahead, and then he saw what at first seemed impossible. The limp tawny shape sprawled half in the road, half in the grass, a lion, its golden coat dulled by dust, its ribs heaving shallow breaths, and around its neck the cruel outline of a steel snare, half buried in the dirt where hunters had anchored it to trap and haul their prize, the cable cutting into flesh with each shallow breath, tightening with every twitch. But what defied belief, what froze Elijah in place so completely he forgot to shift his truck into park until it lurched forward another foot, was that the buffalo was not killing the lion, not trampling it as would be expected in the endless feud between predator and prey, but was standing astride it like a guardian, positioning his enormous body between the wounded predator and the world, lowering his head each time the lion stirred as though to comfort or shield it from unseen danger. The scene was so out of balance with every law Elijah knew of the natural order that his pulse hammered in disbelief. Here was a herbivore protecting a carnivore, an ancient rival, from the very men who had likely set the trap to claim the lion for a trophy. Elijah killed the engine, silence rushing in except for the whistling wind and the faint rattle of loose metal from the snare chain, and he whispered without meaning to, "Why, old bull? Why are you doing this?" The buffalo turned its massive head slightly, just enough to let one dark eye fall on him, and for a breath Elijah could have sworn that look was not one of mindless animal instinct but of deliberate warning. "Come closer and you must prove yourself." Behind him another truck pulled up, the crunch of tires breaking the stillness, and out stepped May Turner, a rancher's daughter who often volunteered for wildlife rescue calls, her eyes going wide at the sight. "Lord above," she muttered, brushing strands of wind-blown hair from her face, "that's a mountain lion, isn't it? And he's guarding it?" Elijah nodded slowly, still mesmerized, before replying, "That's exactly what it looks like." The lion gave a weak growl, little more than a whisper of sound, and tried to shift, but the snare tightened with a metallic twang, making the animal jerk in pain, and the buffalo immediately stamped one hoof, blowing out a blast of hot breath that fogged in the cooling air, his muscles rippling as he positioned himself even more directly over the cat. May's hand went instinctively toward the rifle slung across her back, but Elijah raised his palm quickly, whispering, "Don't even think about it." He's not attacking, it's the opposite. He's protecting. May blinked at him as though he'd spoken madness, yet the evidence stood before them, a massive herbivore in obvious pain himself, blood staining his side from some earlier wound, choosing not to leave the injured predator but to hold his ground over it, defying every survival instinct etched into his kind. The wind howled again, carrying with it the scent of oncoming rain, and Elijah felt the heaviness of decision settle into his chest. They could not leave, not now, not when the lion's breathing was so shallow and the buffalo's legs trembled from strain, but to intervene might trigger a charge, and a buffalo at full tilt could crush a truck, let alone a man. He glanced at May, saw her uncertainty turn to resolve, and knew that whatever mystery had drawn this buffalo to such an extraordinary act was only beginning to reveal itself, and that to turn away would be to betray not only the animals but the land itself. Elijah took a slow step forward, crunch of gravel under his boots sharp in the silence, and the buffalo's head swung down, horns gleaming, nostrils flaring, a warning so clear it froze him in place, yet the animal did not advance, did not lunge, only waited, as though measuring the man against some unseen test. Elijah whispered, "You're hurt, aren't you? But you won't leave him." The buffalo's tail flicked once, the only answer, and Elijah's eyes followed the line of the steel snare into the tall grass, where fresh boot prints pressed deep into the soil, leading off toward the ridge, evidence of the hunters who had set this cruel trap, evidence that the danger was not gone but perhaps still near. His breath caught as he realized the truth. The buffalo was not just protecting the lion from the trap, he was guarding it from those who would return to finish their work. The prairie stretched endless around them, vast skies bruised with the weight of a storm, and yet in that moment Elijah felt the world collapse to this single point: the buffalo, the lion, the trap, and the mystery of a bond no human had ever recorded before. And as thunder rolled in the distance, he knew the story was far from finished, for somewhere beyond that ridge shadows moved, the hunters returning. Elijah Crow's boots crunched against the hard-packed earth as he advanced slowly toward the old bull, every step deliberate, measured, conscious of the tremor in the air as the buffalo shifted his immense weight, pawing the ground and stamping once more to let the approaching humans know that while he might not attack, he would not yield either. And May Turner stayed just behind him, her hands clenched in fists of resolve, eyes wide as she struggled to comprehend the scene that unfolded like something out of a myth, a story she had only ever heard whispered from old ranchers and tribal elders about buffalo that defied the ordinary, buffalo that seemed to hold within them a consciousness that transcended instinct, and now she could see it for herself, every coarse hair along the bull's massive frame bristling, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling to catch every sound from the distant ridge and the soft rustle of the tall grass where the lion's golden form stirred weakly under the weight of the trap. And as Elijah raised his hand in a calming gesture, murmuring softly in the voice he had spent decades perfecting to soothe distressed wildlife, "Easy, easy, we're not here to hurt you, we just want to help," he noticed the subtle shift in the buffalo's stance, the way one massive eye tracked him with intelligence rather than fear, and how the muscles along the hump twitched with tension, coiled like a spring, ready to defend but willing to listen, a negotiation conducted not in words but in the slow, careful movements of two sentient beings who understood the stakes without a single sound. And then the lion made a pitiful, strangled sound, and Elijah froze, his heart clenching at the pain and exhaustion reflected in the trembling shoulders and shallow breaths of the magnificent predator, a creature whose species had ruled these plains for centuries, now at the mercy of a trap set by humans who had no idea that life itself had chosen a protector in the form of the buffalo standing above it. And he whispered to May, voice barely audible over the whistling wind, "We have to get that snare off, we have to free him, but we have to do it without spooking the bull." And May nodded, swallowing hard, her gaze never leaving the massive horns, the broad chest, the eyes that seemed to hold not only pain but purpose, a clarity of mission that defied everything she had ever known about animals. And together they began the slow approach, Elijah shifting his weight, speaking softly, each word carefully modulated, reaching out as he had with frightened bison calves and wounded elk over the years, his hand trembling slightly as he neared the trap, the steel chain glinting ominously in the half-light of the late afternoon, dust rising in eddies around the bull's hooves as he shifted slightly, watching, assessing, measuring their intent, and it was then that Elijah saw it. The small paw prints pressed into the dirt alongside the snare, the claw marks in the soil, evidence that the lion had tried desperately to escape, and it hit him like a blow. Someone had set this trap deliberately, a hunter who did not care for life, and yet the buffalo had chosen a different path, a path of courage, of empathy, of compassion that seemed almost impossible to comprehend, and May whispered, voice quivering, "Elijah, why is he protecting it?" And he shook his head, eyes fixed on the tension in the bull's shoulders, the labored heaving of its chest, the way it turned to face any sound coming from the ridge. "I don't know. But whatever it is, we're going to find out," and the wind carried the faint metallic twang of the snare, the distant rumble of thunder over the canyon, and the faint whisper of movement in the brush beyond, the first signs that the hunters might be returning, and Elijah knew they had no time to waste. He gestured toward May, pointing to a fallen log a few yards away, a shield they could use to approach the trap from a less threatening angle, and together they crouched low, moving in near silence, each step synchronized, attuned to the rhythm of the buffalo, who remained motionless, the sheer size of him both a deterrent and a reassurance, until they were close enough for Elijah to kneel beside the snare, assessing the steel cable, its cruel tension cutting into the lion's neck, and the lion flinched weakly, and then the buffalo lowered his massive head slightly, letting out a low rumble that vibrated through the earth, almost as if to say, "Be careful," and Elijah froze, understanding the gravity of the connection before him, that this was not a simple rescue but a collaboration, a delicate dance between species, guided by trust and respect, and he could feel May's hand brush against his back in silent encouragement as he reached for the chain, twisting it slowly, carefully, aware of the immense power standing just feet away, a creature capable of destroying them in a heartbeat yet choosing to allow them passage, and then a sharp crack echoed from the ridge, a branch snapping underfoot, and the buffalo stiffened, ears forward, muscles tensing, yet it did not charge, only stamped once, loud enough to reverberate through the air, and the lion whimpered weakly, sensing the danger but also sensing the protector who would not abandon it, and Elijah's hands moved faster now, releasing the tension in the snare, and the lion's neck was free, its chest heaving ragged breaths as it collapsed slightly against the grass, but the bull did not step back, only lowered his head further, gently nudging the lion with the tip of his muzzle, encouraging it to rise, and Elijah marveled at the intelligence displayed, at the way the buffalo understood not only that the lion was trapped but what needed to happen to correct the injustice, and May whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. He's thinking," and Elijah nodded, voice hushed, he knows what's right," and then the lion struggled to its feet, legs shaky, eyes wide and grateful, and the buffalo stayed close, watching every movement, ensuring that no harm would come now that freedom had been granted, and yet the danger was not over, for from the ridge came the faint sound of voices, shouting and carrying weapons, and Elijah realized the hunters had returned, perhaps following the scent or tracks left in the dirt, and the buffalo shifted, placing himself squarely between the approaching threat and the lion, his great head lowered, a living barrier, every muscle coiled and ready, and Elijah knew there would be no retreat, no turning back. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, a story that would defy expectation, that would challenge assumptions about wildlife, about courage, and about the power of empathy across species, and the wind carried the scent of rain and dust, mingling with the faint iron tang of the lion's blood, and the prairie stretched endlessly behind them, vast, unforgiving, yet in that space of tension and impending danger, a miracle was unfolding, a revelation that would change the way humans viewed the wild forever, and as Elijah's mind raced with questions, why had the buffalo acted this way, what had triggered this protective instinct, could such compassion exist beyond instinct, could it truly be moral, could it be choice? He realized that he had only scratched the surface of the story, that the real investigation was only beginning, and the buffalo's dark eyes, glinting with sweat and dust, met his once again, and in that gaze was the unspoken message, there is more to see, more to understand, and whatever is to come next, the bond between man and beast, between predator and protector, would define the outcome, and just as the first drops of rain began to fall, mingling with dust to form a gritty haze, a faint sound under the buffalo's hooves caught Elijah's attention. A low whimper, almost imperceptible beneath the wind, a sound That hinted at something hidden, something precious, something that explained the impossible act they had just witnessed, and he whispered to May, "Do you hear that?" And she leaned closer, eyes narrowing, and the buffalo shifted again, hooves scraping against stone and dirt, lowering his head toward the sound, and in that instant Elijah knew they were not just rescuing a lion, they were about to uncover the secret reason why this ancient, powerful creature had defied every law of nature, risking his own life to protect a being that should have been his natural enemy. And as the wind whipped the prairie around them, and the storm rolled closer, and the hunters' voices grew sharper in the distance, the first true sense of the mystery revealed itself. Beneath the buffalo's massive frame, pressed close to his chest, hidden in a small hollow, was something they had not yet seen, something the bull would not abandon, and whatever it was, it had the potential to change everything. Elijah thought he knew about courage, loyalty, and the boundless intelligence and compassion of the creatures of this land, and with that realization, Elijah took a careful breath, stepped closer, and prepared to discover the truth. Even as the storm broke overhead, the rain lashing the prairie, the sky dark and electric, and the buffalo, steadfast and unyielding, waited, guarding the secret he alone seemed to understand, a secret that would soon unravel a tale of heroism, empathy, and the extraordinary bond that can exist between species, a tale that would begin not in captivity or on a page of history, but here, in the open wind-swept plains of Montana, where the thunder rolled, the grass bent under the storm, and the old bull, massive and wounded, yet unbroken, continued to stand as a silent sentinel, the protector of a life no human could have saved without his intervention. And Elijah realized that from this moment on, he was no longer just a witness, he was part of the story. A participant in a miracle that defied understanding, and he knew, with every fiber of his being, that the world would not soon forget what was about to unfold. The storm had fully descended across the Montana prairie, wind driving rain in thick sheets that plastered Elijah Crow's jacket to his chest and made his boots slip in the slick earth, the sky a bruised tapestry of gray and silver streaked with flashes of lightning that illuminated the vast, open landscape in brief, terrifying bursts. Yet nothing in the fury of nature could compete with the tension building between the massive buffalo and the hidden life he was guarding, for beneath the bull's broad chest, pressed against the shallow depression in the ground, lay the small, trembling form of a mountain lion cub, barely weeks old, soaked to the bone, its golden fur matted with mud and rain, eyes wide with fear and confusion. And as Elijah took in the sight, a mix of awe and disbelief tightened his chest, for he realized fully that the bull had risked everything, his own injuries, exhaustion, exposure to human danger, to protect a creature that nature itself would have made his adversary. And May Turner, crouched slightly behind him, whispered in wonder, he's saving it," and the words barely escaped her lips before the buffalo let out a low, rumbling bellow that shook the air and seemed to reverberate through the ground itself, a warning not just to the approaching storm, not just to the humans near him, but to the entire world that any threat to the cub would meet resistance the likes of which the plains had rarely seen. And Elijah knew they had to act carefully, each movement measured, because a wrong step could trigger a charge from a creature whose hooves could crush bone and whose horns could impale with lethal precision. Yet the cub's survival depended on their intervention, and he drew a slow, steadying breath, feeling the rhythm of the bull's breathing beneath his eyes, the rise and fall of the massive chest, the tremor in the legs from both fatigue and the emotional strain of guarding something so fragile. And he whispered softly, "We're here to help. We're not going to hurt him. Just let us help him." And the buffalo lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling forward, a subtle gesture that Elijah interpreted as consent, or at least as acknowledgement, and he began inching forward, careful not to make sudden movements, not to step on loose stones, not to create a sound that would startle either the cub or its enormous guardian. And May followed closely, her eyes locked on the bull, heart hammering, mind racing with the impossibility of the situation. For they were witnessing intelligence and compassion far beyond what was typically credited to any animal, the choice to protect, to prioritize another life over one's own safety, an ethical action expressed not in human words but in instinct informed by some deeper, almost spiritual understanding of duty and empathy. And as Elijah neared the snare still partially buried in the mud, twisting and catching on roots, the bull's body shifted slightly, rumbling again, and he sensed the tension in every fiber of muscle, the coiled power ready to spring if the cub were threatened, and yet, remarkably, the buffalo did not attack him, did not even lunge, only maintained his vigil, the very image of patience and restraint in the face of danger, and the storm intensified, wind whipping rain into sharp needles that stung the skin, lightning illuminating the scene in stark, ghostly contrasts, casting shadows of immense horns over the soaked earth, and Elijah realized the danger was not only natural, for somewhere beyond the ridge, hidden in the curtain of rain and mist, were the hunters who had set the trap, returning to claim the lion for themselves, and if they arrived while the rescue was underway, the buffalo would have to defend the cub with everything he had, and there would be no negotiation, no compromise, only survival, and he shivered, both from the cold and the gravity of the moment. He knelt by the snare, hands trembling slightly, and worked methodically to loosen the tension in the twisted steel, coaxing it from the lion's small neck without creating sudden noise, all while keeping one eye on the bull, whose ears twitched, muscles taut, eyes locked on the movement as if calculating the risk and weighing trust against instinct, and then the cub mewed softly, a tiny, frightened sound that made Elijah's heart constrict, and he whispered, almost there, just a little more. And finally, with a careful twist, the cable fell away, clattering harmlessly into the mud, and the lion struggled, legs weak but determined, to rise, collapsing partially, then pushing upward again, shaking off rain and mud, and the bull lowered his massive head further, nose brushing the cub's fur, gently encouraging it to find balance and strength. And Elijah could not help but marvel at the tenderness displayed in a creature of such size and power, a tenderness directed at a natural enemy. And May whispered, barely audible, "It's like he knows exactly what to do," and Elijah nodded, voice low and reverent, "He does, he knows." And then, as if sensing the humans were allies rather than threats, the bull took a slow step backward, but only enough to give them space, his eyes never leaving the cub, every muscle coiled in readiness to shield, to push, to defend, to charge if necessary, and Elijah realized that they were no longer merely rescuing the cub, they were collaborating with the buffalo, following the silent instructions of this sentinel who understood the stakes more profoundly than any human could articulate. He gestured for May to help guide the cub, her hands trembling, voice gentle, soothing the frightened creature as it stumbled, shaking and wet, toward the shelter of a nearby rock outcropping that would offer some cover from the unrelenting wind, and the buffalo shifted again, moving to place himself directly between the cub and the ridge, hooves scraping gravel, chest heaving, horns angled like dark sentinels, and every time the cub faltered, the bull would nudge it gently with his nose, muzzle brushing fur, a silent signal of encouragement, and Elijah felt a lump in his throat at the display of pure, conscious care, the recognition that this was more than instinct, that in some way the buffalo understood the concept of protection, of guardianship, and of moral responsibility, and the rain blurred the horizon, wind lashing faces, and distant thunder rolling across the prairie like the drumbeat of some cosmic judgment, and then, from the ridge, a shout broke through the storm, carrying the unmistakable inflection of a human voice. Urgent and demanding, and Elijah knew the hunters had seen or sensed something, and the buffalo tensed, hooves bracing in the mud, chest expanding with each heave of breath, and yet he did not charge, only stared, measured, waited, and Elijah understood that the next moments would define whether the cub would survive, whether the story of compassion would be written in the blood and mud of this storm-swept land or snuffed out by human greed and violence, and he whispered to May, "We have to move, now. Follow my lead. Keep calm. Let him guide us," and with that, they edged closer to the buffalo, moving in tandem with the rhythm of his body, every step synchronized, trusting entirely in the judgment of this giant whose life experience in the wild, whose wisdom and moral courage, far exceeded their own, and as they reached the sheltering rock, the cub stumbled, fell, and the buffalo rushed forward, lowering his head to nudge it upright, the motion so precise, so careful, so deliberate that Elijah's eyes stung with emotion, and then the cub scrambled to its feet, shaking mud and rain from its coat, eyes bright, breathing ragged but alive, and the bull bellowed, a sound that reverberated across the prairie, announcing victory not in triumph but in the simple, sacred act of survival and guardianship, and as Elijah stepped closer to assess the cub's condition, the buffalo lowered his head, nostrils flaring, gaze measuring, and in that glance, Elijah felt a trust he had never experienced before, a silent permission to approach, to examine, to help, for the animal had recognized in them allies rather than threats, participants in a shared mission of compassion and rescue, and he knelt beside the cub, checking for injuries beyond exhaustion and the trap, murmuring soothing words, and May brushed rain from its fur, whispering encouragement, while the buffalo remained close, massive and immovable, guarding the vulnerable as if nothing else in the world existed, and as the storm continued to lash. Lightning cracking across the sky, they realized the hunters were still approaching, shouting, perhaps trying to scare them off, yet the bull remained steadfast, his eyes narrowed, ears forward, chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and in that moment, Elijah understood something profound, that this was not merely a rescue, not merely an extraordinary act of protection, but a living testament to the intelligence, empathy, and moral courage of a creature that humans had long underestimated, a reminder that in the vast, rugged wilderness, bonds could form in the most unexpected ways, alliances could defy nature itself, and compassion could transcend species, and as the hunter's shouts grew closer, the buffalo shifted slightly, hooves digging into the soft, muddy ground, horns angled with precision, standing as a wall between predator and danger, between life and death, and Elijah and May, hearts pounding, followed the silent cues of the great beast, realizing that they had become participants in a story that would redefine understanding, that would ripple through the world far beyond this storm-swept plain, a story that began with a single act of defiance, a single choice to protect, and that choice now extended to all of them, binding human and buffalo in a fragile, awe-inspiring alliance, and as the cub finally found footing and huddled under the sheltering rocks, eyes wide, ears flicking at every sound, the buffalo let out another low, rumbling bellow. Surveying the approaching threat, and Elijah knew that the true climax was not yet over, for the battle between greed and guardianship, between human ambition and the wisdom of the wild, was only beginning, and he braced himself, heart hammering, rain soaking through every layer, knowing that whatever came next, this day would be remembered forever, not only for the miraculous survival of the cub but for the courage, intelligence, and unwavering moral compass of the buffalo who had chosen to act when the world around him had chosen violence, and with that realization, Elijah took a steadying breath, prepared to act alongside the greatest guardian he had ever encountered, aware that history, understanding, and perhaps even the future of how humans perceived the wild would be written on the rain-slicked prairie under the watchful eyes of this magnificent, wounded, yet unbroken beast. The storm finally began to ease, its fury retreating into distant clouds, leaving a sodden, glistening prairie where puddles reflected the fragmented sunlight breaking through the gray, and Elijah Crow stood beside the buffalo, chest heaving, rain running in rivulets down his face, eyes scanning the cub now nestled under the protection of a broad rock ledge, shivering but alive, while May Turner moved carefully, draping her jacket over the soaked animal and murmuring gentle reassurances, the scent of wet earth and sagebrush mingling with the faint iron tang of the cub's blood and the rich musk of the bull who had guarded it with a vigilance that defied belief, and as Elijah approached the old bull, gently laying a hand against the thick, matted fur along his massive shoulder, he felt the heat radiating from the creature, the pulse of life, the residual tension that still coiled through muscles like steel cables, and he whispered softly, "You did it, you saved him," and the buffalo exhaled slowly, almost as if acknowledging the praise, eyes blinking once, dark and intelligent, observing every movement, every subtle shift in the humans around him, aware that they were no threat, that their purpose aligned with his own, and yet his body still bore the marks of their ordeal, shallow cuts along the flank where the hunter's snares had snagged, patches of torn hide from brambles. Fatigue etched into every movement of his massive frame, and Elijah knew that their next steps would be critical, for the bull's recovery depended not only on rest and food but on understanding, on being treated with the respect and patience he so clearly deserved, and May crouched beside him, brushing rain from his eyes, murmuring, "He's incredible, he's more than anyone could have imagined," and Elijah nodded, voice low, "He's a sentinel, a guardian, and he's choosing to trust us," and the cub, now calmer, began to lick at its own fur, cleaning away the mud and blood, while the bull remained close, watching with unwavering vigilance, a living barrier between the vulnerable creature and the world beyond, and as they worked to establish a makeshift enclosure to protect both animals from the harsh elements and any lingering human threats, Elijah's mind raced with questions. Who had set the trap? Why had they targeted such a young predator? What had drawn the buffalo to intervene? And could this act of compassion signify a level of intelligence and moral reasoning previously unrecognized in the species? And when the local wildlife authorities arrived, alerted by May's calls, they approached with a mixture of skepticism and urgency, noting the enormous size and remarkable condition of the bull, yet pausing in stunned silence when they witnessed the relationship forming between the two animals, the way the cub sought refuge near the buffalo's legs, the way the buffalo lowered his head to nudge and encourage the smaller creature, a display of behavior so nuanced and deliberate that the officers exchanged glances, murmuring to each other about what this could mean for studies of animal cognition and interspecies interaction, and as veterinarians carefully moved to assess the bull's injuries, administering antiseptics, binding minor lacerations, and offering nutrient-rich supplements, the buffalo remained remarkably still, eyes tracking every movement, nostrils flaring with awareness, exhaling slowly as if granting permission for the humans to provide aid. And Elijah could not help but marvel at the patience, the restraint, the trust he witnessed, for this was not a wild creature merely tolerating humans, it was a conscious choice, a deliberate acceptance of partnership, and as the cub nuzzled against the bull's foreleg, blinking sleepily, Elijah realized that the story was far from over, that the events of the day would ripple outward in ways no one could yet predict, for the hunters who had set the trap remained unaccounted for, leaving a question of human culpability and intervention that needed resolution, and as he guided the authorities to the site where the snare had been discovered, pointing out the disturbed soil, the torn vegetation, the subtle signs that indicated deliberate placement, he saw the officers taking careful notes, photographing the scene, and exchanging grim looks, their skepticism giving way to recognition of both the severity and the uniqueness of the situation, and May, standing beside him, whispered, "This bull, he's teaching us something," and Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of truth in her words, for every action of the buffalo, every nudge, every rumble, every steadfast stance, spoke of an understanding that transcended instinct, an empathy for life beyond species boundaries, and as the day wore on, the rain subsided, leaving the prairie sparkling with droplets that clung to every blade of grass and stone, and researchers began to arrive, their excitement barely contained, recognizing the rare opportunity to document an extraordinary behavioral phenomenon. Genetic samples were taken to verify lineage, notes were made on muscle tone, stamina, and recovery, and all the while, the buffalo remained patient, observing the humans, interacting only when necessary, and ever vigilant over the cub who had now taken tentative steps, wobbling yet determined, guided by the protective presence of the massive guardian who had defied the natural order to ensure its safety. And as Elijah knelt to record observations in his weathered notebook, he felt an almost spiritual connection forming, a bridge between human and animal, predator and protector, nature and witness, a connection that was fragile yet profound, teaching lessons not only of courage but of compassion, resilience, and the potential for choice even in the most primal beings. And as night fell, the storm replaced by a mist that rolled low over the prairie, moonlight catching on wet fur and glistening eyes, the buffalo settled near the cub, breathing deeply, muscles relaxing for the first time since the morning, and Elijah realized that this was the moment when recovery truly began, not only physically but emotionally, that the bull had not only saved a life but also imparted a lesson that would echo in human understanding of animal intelligence and interspecies morality. And in the days that followed, interviews with local ranchers and witnesses began to fill in the backstory. The hunters, greedy and careless, had sought the lion cub for sport, setting a trap with no regard for life, and yet the buffalo had intervened, acting with deliberate strategy, guiding humans toward understanding, shielding the vulnerable, and by his actions, he had forced the local community to reconsider their relationship with the wild, with creatures long regarded as property or nuisance. And as media crews began to arrive, cameras trained on the bull and his cub, Elijah noted the subtle interactions, the protective stance, the gentle nudges, the intelligent observation, the calculated positioning to block any potential threat, behaviors that would later form the basis of groundbreaking research into cognitive empathy, problem solving, and the moral frameworks present in keystone species. And throughout it all, the buffalo tolerated their presence, allowing medical p. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of careful observation, gradual trust building, and meticulous planning, for Elijah Crow and May Turner knew that the buffalo, whom they had come to call Ironhide, due to the sheer resilience and strength etched into every sinew of his massive body, required both physical recovery and emotional assurance, and the cub, now thriving under his guardian's watchful eye, had become a living testament to what they had witnessed: intelligence, empathy, and a moral consciousness in a creature often underestimated and misunderstood. And as the sun rose each morning over the wide Montana prairie, casting long golden shadows across the glistening grass and highlighting the chestnut richness of Ironhide's coat, Elijah and May set to work, constructing a secure but expansive enclosure that allowed freedom of movement while providing safety from lingering human threats and harsh weather, ensuring that both animals could exercise, graze, and regain their natural strength. And as veterinarians checked on Ironhide's wounds, carefully cleaning scars, applying healing salves, and supplementing nutrition with protein-rich feeds, the buffalo displayed an extraordinary calm, allowing touch and examination without the slightest hint of aggression, his massive eyes dark pools of awareness and understanding, tracking every gesture and movement with a depth that seemed almost human. And researchers from the local university began to arrive in shifts, notebooks and cameras in hand, documenting every interaction, every subtle cue, noting the remarkable patience and deliberate, careful behavior that Ironhide demonstrated, the way he positioned himself to shield the cub from wind, the way he nudged the young lion gently when it stumbled, the way he would lower his head to guide it through uneven terrain. And in interviews with journalists, Elijah explained with quiet awe, "What we are seeing is extraordinary. This is not instinct alone. This is intelligence, this is compassion, this is choice." And as the story spread, the public became captivated, the images of the bull and his cub sparking conversations about empathy in wildlife, moral responsibility, and conservation. And soon, local officials, inspired by the unprecedented attention, began to discuss creating a permanent wildlife preserve that would protect not only Ironhide and his cub but other species facing the dangers of human interference, poaching, and habitat loss. And in these discussions, Elijah argued passionately, drawing from his field experience and the lessons he had learned from Ironhide's behavior, emphasizing the importance of space, freedom, and respect for the natural intelligence of wildlife, noting that protection and understanding were inseparable. And as the weeks passed, Ironhide regained his full strength, his massive legs carrying him with renewed power, muscles rippling beneath the thick coat, horns glinting in the sun, every step measured, confident, and majestic. And the cub, once trembling and weak, now followed closely, learning from his guardian, mimicking movements, exploring the boundaries of their temporary home under watchful eyes. And Elijah marveled at the bond that had formed, a relationship that transcended species, a silent dialogue of trust, guidance, and mutual respect. And as the first official assessment of the preserve was conducted, scientists were astounded to find not only evidence of cognitive problem-solving in Ironhide but also signs of emotional intelligence, behaviors that suggested an understanding of life, death, and moral action far beyond what had previously been documented in buffalo. And public interest soared, with media outlets broadcasting the story of Ironhide and his cub, interviews with the team, and footage of the two animals moving through the prairie, protective, nurturing, and aware, sparking conversations on social media, in schools, and among policymakers. And soon, a foundation was proposed to fund the permanent sanctuary, with Elijah and May as key advocates, meeting with local leaders, conservationists, and indigenous elders who shared traditional knowledge of the buffalo as sacred and keystone species, emphasizing cultural respect, historical context, and ecological importance. And Ironhide, despite the presence of cameras, visitors, and researchers, continued to exhibit the same deliberate behaviors, standing guard, nudging the cub when necessary, grazing with measured movements, and allowing the team to observe, record, and analyze, forming a model for understanding interspecies cooperation, the intelligence of wild animals, and the moral choices that could emerge under extraordinary circumstances. And in quiet moments, Elijah would kneel beside the bull, feeling the heat of his body, brushing wet grass from his eyes, murmuring words of gratitude and respect. And the bull would nuzzle gently, exhale slowly, acknowledging the Connection without fear or aggression, a silent communication that conveyed understanding, acceptance, and a shared purpose, and as the sanctuary plan solidified, Rawhide was gradually reintroduced to a larger, secure area of protected prairie, where he could exercise full range, interact with the environment, and eventually meet other buffalo, all while maintaining his bond with the cub, now growing rapidly, displaying agility and curiosity, and learning lessons in survival, protection, and trust, guided by the immense presence and intelligence of his guardian. And the public continued to follow their progress, captivated not only by the narrative of rescue and survival but by the deeper implications, that animals could exhibit forms of moral behavior, could act with purpose, compassion, and awareness, challenging assumptions and inspiring a broader commitment to conservation, empathy, and ethical stewardship of the natural world. And as the first major press conference was held at the sanctuary site, with local reporters, scientists, and conservation advocates in attendance, Elijah stood before the crowd, his eyes scanning the gathered public, cameras clicking, microphones extended, and spoke with conviction. Ironhide has shown us that intelligence, courage, and compassion are not exclusive to humans. He has made choices that saved a life, protected the vulnerable, and taught us lessons we would do well to heed. It is our responsibility to honor that, to protect, to preserve, and to learn from the wisdom inherent in the wild. And behind him, through a clearing in the trees, Ironhide and his cub could be seen grazing, moving together with a synchronization born of trust, every gesture deliberate, every movement a lesson, and the crowd fell silent, struck by the majesty, the intelligence, and the sheer presence of the bull who had become a symbol not only of resilience and survival but of hope, empathy, and interspecies connection. And in the weeks that followed, the sanctuary opened to controlled scientific observation, allowing researchers to study Ironhide, his cub, and the behavior of other buffalo introduced to the environment, documenting social hierarchies, protective behaviors, communication patterns, and cognitive problem-solving, with findings that would later inform wildlife management policies, educational programs, and conservation strategies nationwide, while Elijah and May worked tirelessly, ensuring that the animals were safe, observed respectfully, and that their story continued to inspire. And in quiet moments, walking across the misty prairie, sunlight breaking through clouds, dew on the tall grass, the bull and cub moving gracefully, Elijah reflected on the transformation he had witnessed, the lessons learned, and the profound change in perception that had occurred. For Ironhide had not only survived and nurtured life, but had challenged humanity's understanding of intelligence, morality, and compassion in the animal kingdom, proving that even in the face of danger, fear, and injury, an individual could act with courage, wisdom, and empathy. And as he stood, watching the pair disappear into the rolling hills, he knew that the sanctuary, the research, the stories, and the public awareness that had blossomed from this singular act of guardianship would endure, and that the impact of Ironhide's choices, the strength of his protection, and the depth of his bond with the cub would ripple across the world, inspiring scientists, policymakers, and ordinary people to reconsider their relationships with the wild, to recognize the potential for consciousness and compassion in animals, and to act with greater responsibility, understanding, and care. And in the quiet of the evening, as the prairie glowed with the soft gold of sunset, Elijah whispered, "We are forever changed by what you have taught us." And Ironhide, massive and noble, lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes dark and knowing, as if acknowledging the truth of the words, the bond unbroken, the lessons clear, and the path forward illuminated not only by sunlight but by the enduring power of courage, empathy, and connection between species, a legacy that would continue to grow, shaping hearts, minds, and policies, ensuring that the story of Ironhide and his cub would be remembered, studied, and cherished for generations, a living testament to the extraordinary potential within the wild, the possibility of choice, and the enduring impact of compassion, wisdom, and protection that transcends the boundaries of human understanding. And as night fell, stars blinking in the clear prairie sky, the bull stood sentinel, cub at his side, both safe, both thriving, both teaching humanity that courage, empathy, and guardianship are not the province of any single species, but a universal capacity, waiting to be recognized, honored, and nurtured. The years that followed were marked not by silence but by the reverberations of a story that had begun on a storm-lashed prairie, a tale of courage, compassion, and interspecies connection that had begun with Ironhide, the magnificent buffalo, and his cub, now strong, agile, and inseparable from their guardian yet fully wild in spirit, roaming the protected expanses of the Montana sanctuary established through the tireless advocacy of Elijah Crow, May Turner, and a coalition of scientists, conservationists, indigenous elders, and local officials who recognized that the extraordinary events they had witnessed carried lessons far beyond the bounds of a single rescue, and as the sun rose over the rolling grasslands, casting golden light across dew-drenched blades and illuminating the chestnut richness of Ironhide's massive coat, the bull stood at the crest of a small hill, surveying the expanse with eyes dark, intelligent, and aware, nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scent of prairie sage, distant pines, and the faint traces of wildlife that shared the sanctuary, a living symbol of resilience and wisdom, and Elijah, kneeling at a respectful distance, journal in hand, felt the weight of years of observation, reflection, and advocacy pressing upon him, for he had come to understand that what they had witnessed was not merely a moment of heroism but a transformative phenomenon with implications for science, culture, policy, and the collective human consciousness. Regarding the natural world, and as he scribbled notes on behavior, interspecies interaction, and the subtleties of emotional intelligence displayed by the bull, he could hear the soft crunch of hooves as Ironhide moved closer to the cub, guiding it gently through a shallow stream that reflected the morning light, the cub's small body brushing against the bull's flank, trusting, learning, alive, and the scene was one of majesty, of bond, of a lesson that needed no words yet spoke volumes about choice, protection, and moral action in the animal kingdom, and May, standing beside him, her eyes reflecting both awe and gratitude, whispered, "He's teaching the world what we've learned," and Elijah nodded, feeling the truth of her words as Ironhide paused, nostrils quivering, lifting his head to glance in their direction, acknowledging their presence yet asserting his autonomy, a living reminder that the wild could act with intention, that empathy and guardianship were not exclusively human qualities. And as cameras from scientific teams recorded the interactions, documenting everything from movement patterns to nuanced social behaviors, and as drones hovered to capture aerial perspectives of the sprawling sanctuary, it became clear that Ironhide's legacy would extend far beyond the borders of this prairie, influencing research on animal cognition, ethical treatment of wildlife, and public perception. And soon, a collaborative study was published in a prominent journal, detailing the bull's behaviors, protective positioning, deliberate nudges, guiding gestures, and the evident decision-making that had saved a vulnerable predator, challenging long-held assumptions that moral reasoning and empathy were solely human traits, and this research sparked debate, curiosity, and inspiration in scientific communities, in classrooms, and in public forums, encouraging a re-evaluation of the relationship between humans and the species with whom they share the planet, and as legislators and conservation advocates cited the case in policy discussions, proposals emerged for increased protections, expanded preserves, and educational initiatives designed to foster awareness of intelligence and compassion in wild animals, while indigenous leaders contributed cultural and historical insights, explaining that the buffalo had long been revered not just as a source of sustenance but as a teacher, a guardian, and a symbol of balance, wisdom, and sacredness in the ecosystem, and these perspectives enriched the discourse, bridging traditional knowledge with contemporary science, highlighting that Ironhide's actions were both extraordinary and consistent with the profound role buffalo had historically played in human understanding of the land and its creatures, and at the sanctuary, every sunrise brought a renewed sense of purpose, as researchers, volunteers, and visitors observed Ironhide and his cub, noting the ways the bull taught the young predator survival skills, social cues, and the importance of vigilance, while also displaying patience, trust, and protective instincts that seemed to suggest an awareness of consequence and a capacity for foresight. And in quieter moments, Elijah would walk alone along the edges of the rolling hills, feeling the wind carry the scent of wet grass, sage, and distant wildlife, reflecting on how a single act of courage, the decision of a massive buffalo to intervene in the face of human cruelty, had grown into a movement, a story and a living testament to the potential for understanding and moral choice in species often underestimated, and he would pause to watch Ironhide's massive form move through the prairie, the cub following, occasionally pausing to mimic a step, a glance, or a nudge, their bond a vivid illustration of guidance, protection, and connection that transcended language, species, and expectation. And as evening approached, the sky painted with pinks, purples, and golds, Elijah and May would sit atop a small ridge, binoculars in hand, silently observing the pair as they grazed, rested, and navigated their environment with grace and intelligence, and in those moments, the depth of the story, of courage, empathy, survival, and transformation, resonated fully, not as an anecdote of the wild, but as a universal parable of what is possible when beings act with compassion and choice, and the sanctuary became a hub not only for wildlife protection but for education, inspiration, and reflection, hosting programs where children, students, and adults could witness the intelligence and social complexity of animals firsthand, participate in guided tours emphasizing observation over interference, and learn the broader lessons that Ironhide had imparted through action, silence, and the simple yet profound act of saving a life. And the cub, now growing into a robust and agile predator, continued to demonstrate the teachings of his guardian, exhibiting caution, trust, and learned behaviors that indicated a cognitive and emotional development shaped by the buffalo's presence. And in interviews and conferences, Elijah would emphasize the broader implications, that the natural world holds intelligence, morality, and compassion in forms that humans are only beginning to understand, that protection and stewardship are responsibilities, and that every encounter with wild beings carries the potential to teach, transform, and inspire. And the story of Ironhide reached global audiences, inspiring initiatives in other countries, collaborations between conservationists and indigenous groups, educational programs in schools, and renewed awareness of the intelligence and moral capabilities of animals. And as night fell, stars appearing in an endless velvet sky, the prairie alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the wind whispering across tall grasses, Elijah would stand, looking at Ironhide silhouetted against the horizon, massive, vigilant, majestic, cub at his side, and he realized that the buffalo's legacy was now secure, a beacon for ethical interaction, conservation, and recognition of intelligence across species. And in that quiet, sacred moment, he whispered into the wind, "May your courage, your wisdom, and your compassion continue to guide us all." And the bull, sensing the presence of a human who had come to understand, acknowledged him with a slow blink, a subtle shift of stance, a gentle rumble in the chest, a living acknowledgement of connection and shared purpose. And as Elijah walked back to the sanctuary headquarters, the echo of that bellow carried across the prairie, a reminder that every act of protection, every choice of empathy, every display of courage resonates far beyond the moment, inspiring change, reflection, and action. And as he looked back one last time at Ironhide and his cub resting beneath the stars, silhouetted against the moonlit expanse, he felt a profound certainty that the story would endure, that the lessons would continue to ripple through science, policy, education, and hearts around the world, challenging humanity to act with awareness, respect, and compassion toward the creatures who share our home. And that the legacy of Ironhide, the guardian, the teacher, the courageous and compassionate buffalo, would forever stand as a symbol of the extraordinary potential for understanding, moral choice, and interspecies connection, reminding all who hear the tale that courage and compassion can transcend species, that wisdom can be found in the wild, and that the choices of a single creature can inspire the hearts, minds, and actions of countless others, encouraging every human witness to pause, reflect, and act with empathy, to honor life in all its forms, to protect the vulnerable, and to recognize that in the untamed expanses of the world, as in the vast landscapes of our own hearts, courage, compassion, and connection are the forces that endure, that teach, and that transform. And as the wind whispered through the prairie grasses, carrying the distant calls of nocturnal animals, the scent of sage and wet earth, and the faint echo of Ironhide's deep bellow, Elijah knew without doubt that the world had been changed, that the story of a buffalo who chose to act with empathy had become a legacy, a call to action, and an eternal reminder that love, protection, and moral courage know no bounds, species, or limits, and that the lessons of Ironhide, massive and wise, silent yet profound, would continue to inspire all who took the time to observe, to listen, and to act, leaving a mark on the world as enduring as the prairie itself, vast, wild, and eternal.